The Montana wind did not ask permission. It came down from the mountains the way certain kinds of trouble always arrive, without warning and without apology, moving through the high grass of the September plain like a blade drawn slow across leather. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed bent and straightened, like old men nodding off in a church where the sermon had gone on too long. The sky above was the particular blue that makes a person feel small in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. Wide, honest, completely indifferent to the affairs of the people living beneath it. Ezra Whitfield had ridden through this country for 14 years. He knew every dip and rise of it, every place where the ground went soft after rain, every fence line he had built with his own hands, post by post, wire by wire, in the particular silence of a man working alone, because working alone had become the only kind of work he trusted anymore. He had learned this land the way a man learns the face of someone he loves, slowly and completely, until he could navigate it in the dark without thinking. But today, he was not paying attention to the land. Today, he was rehearsing. He sat straight in the saddle, his dark vest worn to the softness that comes only from years of honest labor, his gray eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the horizon and everything to do with the words he kept arranging and rearranging in his mind, like furniture that would not fit no matter which direction you turned it. Miss Voss. That was the opening. Clear. Respectful. There has been a misunderstanding. He shifted in the saddle. Garrison, the big black gelding who had carried him across 14 Montana winters without complaint, flicked one ear back to listen. My sister acted without my knowledge or my consent. I have made arrangements for your return passage. There is a boarding house in town, clean and reasonably priced. The eastbound train comes through on Tuesday. He counted the words. 15 seconds. 20 at the most, if he allowed for a polite pause in the middle. The kind of pause that says, I am not a cruel man. Only a practical one. He had been practicing this speech for 3 hours. The letter in his vest pocket was from his sister Dorothy, who everyone called Dot, and who had never in her 32 years on this earth encountered a situation she did not feel personally obligated to improve by inserting herself directly into the center of it. The letter had arrived 4 days ago. He had read it 6 times. Each reading produced the same result, a slow tightening in his chest that he recognized as the particular feeling of a man who has lost control of something he believed was safely behind a door he had locked from the inside. Dot had found a matrimonial agency in Boston. She had written to them without telling him. She had paid the deposit with her own money, which she could not afford, and she had described her brother in terms that bore only a passing resemblance to the man Ezra Whitfield had spent the last 3 years becoming. He is kind, she had apparently written, and brave, and good, and he is simply waiting for the right woman to remind him of those things. Ezra had read that particular sentence 4 times before folding the letter and pressing it flat against his knee with the palm of his hand, the way you press down on something that has started to bleed before you have decided how serious the wound actually is. He was not waiting to be reminded of anything. He was not waiting at all. Waiting implied hope. And hope was a thing Ezra Whitfield had set aside carefully, deliberately, 3 winters ago, when the fever came down from the mountains and took everything that mattered and left him standing in a house that was suddenly too large and too quiet and too full of the specific absence of people who should have been in it. Eleanor, Henry. He did not let himself think their names directly. Not on ordinary days. Not anymore. He kept them at the edges of his mind, the way you keep your eyes from the sun, not because you doubt the sun exists, but because looking directly at it leaves you blind for a long time afterward. And there was work to be done, and blindness was a luxury he had stopped allowing himself. He had learned to function in the space between remembering and forgetting. It was not a comfortable space, but it was a manageable one. And then Dot had gone and written a letter to Boston. The train station at Silver Creek appeared in the distance, and Ezra straightened his back and pulled his hat lower and told himself for perhaps the 40th time that this would be simple, clean, brief. He was good at simple. He had made a careful practice of it. What he was not prepared for was the woman who stepped down from the train. The locomotive came in on a wall of steam and noise, hissing and groaning like something alive that had been pushed too hard and had formed a specific resentment about it. The platform at Silver Creek was modest, weathered boards and a single bench, presided over by a station master named Collins, who was 60 years old and largely indifferent to human drama. A handful of passengers stepped down. A merchant with 2 large trunks. A family with 3 children who immediately ran in 3 different directions. An elderly couple who moved together with the careful synchronization of people who have spent decades learning to compensate for each other's limitations. And then she stepped down. She came down the last step of the car alone, without assistance, managing a travel bag in one hand and the trailing hem of her dress in the other, with the focused competence of someone long accustomed to doing things without help. The dress was a faded blue-gray, the color of the sky just before a storm commits to itself. It had been through a long journey. The hem was dusty. The collar showed signs of careful mending, small and precise stitches in thread that was almost but not quite the right shade. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a hat that sat slightly off-center, and several strands had come loose around her face and were moving freely in the September wind. She set a small trunk down on the platform. She looked up. She looked around the station with the expression of a person arriving at a place they have been told about but never seen, checking the reality of it against some interior map they had been carrying for a very long time. It was a searching look, neither afraid nor certain. The look of someone whose arithmetic has not yet produced an answer. Then something in that expression shifted, very slightly, the way a muscle shifts when it tries not to show that it is tired. Her hand moved to the trunk handle and gripped it. The grip was steady, but her knuckles were white. And then Ezra saw it. Just one. A single tear, catching the afternoon light as it moved down her cheek. She wiped it away immediately, quickly, with the practiced motion of someone who has learned to remove evidence before it can be observed. Her chin came up. Her shoulders went back. Her eyes, green as new grass after a long rain, moved across the platform in a slow and deliberate survey. She did not look like a woman asking to be rescued. She looked like a woman who had stopped expecting rescue some time ago and was already calculating what to do next. Something shifted in Ezra Whitfield's chest. He stood very still and waited for it to pass, the way you wait out a cramp, breathing through it and telling yourself it is temporary. It did not pass. It simply changed shape, settling into a hollow below his ribs that he recognized as the place where things go when you are not yet ready to give them a name. He crossed the platform. Miss Voss. His voice came out rougher than he had intended. The practiced smoothness of 15 seconds of rehearsal evaporated entirely, and what was left was just the voice of a man who had not spoken to very many people in a very long time and was slightly out of practice with the basic mechanics of it. She turned. Up close, the exhaustion was more visible. There were fine lines around her eyes that spoke of interrupted sleep and long days. There was a quality to her stillness that was not peace but the near neighbor of it, the stillness of a person who has spent their energy down to the last of it and is now conserving what remains. She was younger than he had expected. She was also, he noticed, against his will, more composed than the situation probably warranted. Mr. Whitfield. Her voice was softer than his, but considerably steadier. I am Nora Voss. I know. He reached into his vest pocket and produced the envelope he had prepared. There was a speech to go along with it. 15 seconds, clean and clear, and rehearsed into smoothness. I need you to hear something before we go any further. My sister had no authority to arrange this. I did not place that advertisement. I am not looking for a wife. He held out the envelope. There is enough here for your return ticket and 2 nights at the boarding house in town. I am sorry you made this journey. That apology is sincere. The color left her face, but her eyes did not leave his. He had expected tears, or anger, or the particular kind of wounded dignity that sometimes arrives wearing the face of accusation. What he received instead was something he could not immediately categorize. She looked at him the way someone looks at a door they have just watched close and are already calculating whether there is a window somewhere on the other side of the room. Dorothy's letters said you knew, she said quietly, that you were expecting me. Dorothy's letters said a great many things that are not accurate. A pause. On the tracks behind her, the locomotive was building pressure for its westward departure, the mechanical breathing of it heavy and deliberate. When is the next eastbound train? Tuesday. She nodded once. Then something very small and very controlled happened in her face, a tightening and a releasing, like a hand that closes into a fist and then deliberately, carefully, opens again. I see. If you could direct me to the boarding house, I will manage from there. The boarding house costs money, Miss Voss. I am aware of that. You said you had... He stopped. I did not say anything yet. Your sister's letters mentioned that you had sold. She paused the length of a single breath. Your sister knows considerably more about my finances than is comfortable. The steadiness in her voice had not wavered, but something behind it had, a single note of strain, audible only if you were listening for it the way you listen for a sound you hope not to hear. I have 17 cents. I sold my mother's pearl necklace to buy the ticket west. It was the last thing she left me. She looked briefly at her hands, then back at him. Her eyes were absolutely dry. It seems it was a poor investment. The westbound train gave a long and mournful whistle. Both of them watched as it began to move, slowly at first, with the heavy and deliberate acceleration of something carrying significant weight, and then faster, and then it was gone around the bend. And the only sound left was the wind moving through the grass beyond the platform and the distant complaint of a hawk somewhere above the hills. Her last road home had just burned itself down. Ezra looked at the envelope in his hand. Then he looked at the woman standing before him. The 17 cents, the small trunk, the carefully mended collar, the hat still slightly off-center, the green eyes that were doing the arithmetic of a situation with no good options and arriving at the conclusion with a dignity that made him feel unexpectedly and uncomfortably, like a man who is being smaller than he knows himself to be.
When did you last eat?
The words came out before the part of his brain responsible for careful decisions had been properly consulted. She hesitated. There was bread yesterday morning, before we crossed into Montana. The dining car was expensive, and I was conserving what I had. She said this without self-pity. It was a simple report of fact, delivered in the tone of a woman who has been conserving things for a very long time and does not expect the world to find this worthy of comment. Ezra put the envelope back in his pocket. He crossed to where she had left her trunk and picked it up with one hand, noting as he did how light it was. He had expected, from Dot's breathless description of the arrangements she had made, a woman arriving with the accumulated weight of a life. What he held weighed perhaps 30 pounds. Come with me. We will get you something to eat. Then we will talk. Mr. Whitfield, you have made your position clear. I am not leaving a woman to go hungry on a train platform. He was walking toward the wagon without looking back. That is not a kindness. That is a minimum. You can argue about the rest over food. A moment of silence behind him, then the sound of footsteps on weathered boards. They rode out of Silver Creek in the kind of silence that exists between two people who have just had an important conversation and are still deciding what it meant. Garrison pulled the wagon at a steady pace, and the September sun moved toward the mountains, and the light across the grasslands went from white to gold to something deeper, the particular amber of a Montana afternoon that Ezra had stopped noticing years ago. Nora Voss had not stopped noticing it. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving across the landscape with a quality of attention he recognized after a moment as genuine wonder. Not the performed delight of someone trying to seem agreeable, something quieter and more honest. The look of a person discovering that a place is larger than they had prepared themselves for. Is your land wide? She asked. It runs to the foothills. That is not what I asked. He glanced at her. She was watching the distant mountains, not looking at him. It is beautiful, he said, and he heard the word come out with a weight he had not intended, the weight of something said after a long silence, in the way that certain truths announce themselves when the door has been open long enough. I have seen it for 14 years, and I have not found anything to compare it to. She did not respond immediately. She kept her eyes on the mountains, and he kept his eyes on the road. And they rode in silence for another mile before she said, quietly, almost to herself, You must have been very happy here. He did not answer. He did not need to. The ranch came into view as they crested the last rise. The main house, 2 stories of weathered pine gone silver gray with years of weather. A broad porch running the full length of the front, the barn, the outbuildings, the corral where 2 horses stood watching the wagon approach with the placid curiosity of animals who have seen everything and found most of it unremarkable. And on the small rise to the west of the house, beneath the old cottonwood tree whose roots ran deep into the hillside, 2 white wooden crosses. Nora saw them. He knew she saw them because something in her stillness changed. A subtle shift in the quality of her attention, not curiosity, and not pity, and something harder to name, something that lived in the space between recognition and restraint. She looked at the crosses for a moment without speaking. Then she looked away, back toward the house, and her face was composed and private in the way a person's face becomes when they have recognized something they did not expect to find and have decided, quietly and without announcement, to treat it with care. She did not ask. Gideon Briggs was at the corral when they pulled in, a man of 50, compact and weathered, built close to the ground by a lifetime of physical work. He watched the wagon approach with the measured expression of a man in the process of forming a judgment he had not yet committed to out loud. Gideon. Ezra climbed down from the wagon. "This is Miss Voss. She will be staying through Tuesday." Gideon looked at Nora. Nora looked at Gideon. Something passed between them that Ezra could not entirely read. "Miss," Gideon said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Briggs." Nora's voice was even and direct. "Ezra tells me you have been with this ranch for 12 years. I imagine there is very little about this operation that you do not know." Gideon blinked. "That is a fair way of putting it. Then I expect I will be asking you a great many questions before Tuesday." She turned toward the house with her travel bag and left both men standing by the wagon. Gideon looked at Ezra. Ezra looked at the space where Nora had been. "I came here to send her back," he said, more to himself than to Gideon. Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching the door through which Nora had disappeared. "I see that worked out," he said, and went back to the horses. Inside, the house was clean in the way a house becomes clean when a single practical person maintains it without sentiment. Everything in its place. Every surface wiped down. No clutter and no decoration and no particular evidence that the person living here had thought of comfort as something worth pursuing. It was the house of the man who had reduced his needs to their functional minimum and found that the minimum was sustainable, if not entirely livable. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and took it in. Ezra built up the fire and set a pot on and found bread and cold beans and a length of dried beef and put them on the table without ceremony. Nora sat and ate with the measured pace of someone demonstrating that they are not as hungry as they are, which meant she was considerably more hungry than she appeared. He refilled her plate once without asking. She accepted without protesting. "Dorothy's letters said you built this house yourself," she said. "Most of it. The main framing I had help with. She said you built it with your wife." His hand stopped moving. "Just for a moment. Dorothy talks too much about things that are not hers to talk about." Nora set down her fork. "I am not trying to cause you pain. I am trying to understand where I have arrived. This house tells a story. I have walked through the kitchen, and I can see how it was organized by someone who thought carefully about how it should be used. The curtains in the front room are not your choices. They are choices made by someone who wanted things to be beautiful and not merely functional." She paused. "I think if I am going to sleep under this roof, even for 3 days, I should know something about the woman who made it a home." The fire popped. Somewhere outside, one of the horses moved in the corral. Her name was Eleanor. The name came out slowly, the way something comes out of a tight space when it has not been moved in a long time. She came here with her father, who was surveying for the railroad. "I was building the first barn." She rode up one afternoon asking for water for her horse, and I stood there like a man who had forgotten the English language entirely. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face and was gone. She laughed, not unkindly. She said she had never seen a man turn that particular shade of red. Nora was watching him with the quiet and complete attention she seemed to give to everything. We were married 6 months later. Her father thought she was making a mistake. He said I had nothing to offer but hard work and empty land. Eleanor said she could see what the land could become. Ezra looked at his hands on the table. When our son Henry came, she said the house finally had a heart. Your son. He would have been 11 this year. A silence that had weight to it. The fever, Nora said. Not a question. The winter of 72. 3 years ago. Nora was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful with the weight it was carrying. My parents died of scarlet fever when I was 17, both of them, within a week of each other. I have some understanding of what that winter was like for you. He looked at her. Loss is its own language, she said. There are people who speak it and people who do not. When you meet someone who speaks it, you can tell. Not because they look sad, because of the way they are careful around certain things. He said nothing. He did not need to. I am not here to replace anyone, Nora continued, and her voice was steady in the way that tells you a person has thought carefully about how to say something and has decided that the direct approach is the only honest one. I know that must be what you fear. I would like you to know that I understand the difference between something that is gone and something that is new. They do not occupy the same space. The fire had burned low. Outside, the Montana night had taken full possession of the sky, and the stars were out in the countless thousands, the way they only appear in places where there are no competing lights, close enough to touch if you climbed high enough. My mother had a saying, Nora said, almost to herself. She told me that happiness is not measured by how long you hold it. It is measured by how deeply you feel it while it is yours. She said she and my father had 20 years together, and that those 20 years were worth a lifetime of lesser love. Ezra looked at this woman across his kitchen table, the woman who had arrived with 17 cents and 1 tear quickly wiped away. The woman who had looked at Eleanor's curtains and understood immediately that they were not his choices. The woman who spoke the language. I should show you to the guest room, he said, because it was the only safe thing left to say. He carried her trunk upstairs. At the top of the landing, she reached for it, and her breath caught, a short and involuntary sound that she controlled immediately, but not quite fast enough. What is it? Nothing. A trunk shifted on the train and caught me. It is nothing. He set the trunk down. Let me see. Mr. Whitfield, I have a medical kit. I have been running cattle for 14 years, and I have used it considerably more than I would have preferred. It is not an imposition. It is practical. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without softness and without decoration, because he had been around language long enough to know that decoration mostly serves to obscure. She let him look. 2 ribs, bruised but not broken. He wrapped them with clean linen, his calloused hands careful in the way that hands become careful when they have learned that carefulness is sometimes the only available form of kindness. Neither of them spoke much. When he was finished, she said thank you, and he said good night, and they went to their separate rooms. But he had been the one to do it. And that, he thought afterward, lying in the dark, was the thing he had not expected. That it had felt so ordinary. That ordinary was what had undone him. He did not sleep. He lay in the room he had shared with Eleanor and stared at the ceiling he had cut and fitted and installed with his own hands and listened to the sounds of the house resettling in the cold. The creak of the floorboard near the window at the top of the stairs that always announced itself. The quiet that followed. He thought about the speech he had not delivered. He thought about the envelope still in his vest pocket. He thought about the way she had looked at the two crosses on the hill without flinching and without looking away. The way you can only look at painful things if you have spent sufficient time with pain to understand that looking directly at it is less dangerous than pretending it is not there. He thought about 17 cents and a pearl necklace that was gone. At some point in the small hours, he heard her footsteps on the stairs, quiet and careful, and then the creak of the front room floor below him. He lay still for 10 minutes, listening to the silence that followed. Then he rose and pulled on his clothes and went down. She was sitting in the chair nearest the cold fireplace, a shawl around her shoulders, her auburn hair down and loose around her face, looking out the front window at the darkness beyond. She had exchanged the gray-blue dress for a white nightgown that had been washed so many times it had gone thin at the elbows. She looked younger like this. She also looked tired in a way that the composed daylight version of her had not permitted to show. "The quiet is different here," she said without turning around. She had heard him on the stairs. In Philadelphia, even the middle of the night has sounds. Horses, distant voices, the harbor. Here the quiet has a weight to it. It takes some getting used to. He sat in the chair across from her and looked at the dead fire. "Most people from cities either hate it," he said, "or they find they cannot go back." Which did Eleanor find? He looked at her. She loved it. She said the quiet meant you could hear yourself think. She said in cities she had to talk to herself in a shout to be heard above everything else. He paused. She used to sit out on the porch in the evenings and just listen. She said it was the most honest sound she had ever heard. Nora turned from the window and looked at him. In the faint light from the banked coals, her face was open in a way it had not been entirely open during the daylight hours. "You loved her completely," she said. "Not an accusation, a recognition." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Then I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am not asking it to cause pain. Only because I believe it matters." She kept her eyes on his. "Do you think she would want you to live the way you have been living? Not the ranch, not the work. The other part. The part where no one comes in and no one leaves, and the house gets very clean and very quiet, and the man inside it slowly becomes part of the furniture." The fire gave a small sound as a coal shifted. "Eleanor was not a woman who would want that," Nora said softly, with the quiet authority of someone speaking about a person they have come to know through the evidence left behind. "The woman who chose those curtains and organized that kitchen and laughed at you for turning red was not a woman who would want the man she loved to turn himself into a caretaker for an empty house." "You did not know her," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "No, but I know the house she made, and I know that people who love hard do not love small. She would have loved you enough to want you to keep going." The silence stretched between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people sitting with a difficult thing and not needing to fill it with noise. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Ezra said after a while. "About your life there." And she did. She told him about the narrow cobblestone streets and the smell of the harbor, about the shop where she had worked as a bookkeeper for 4 years, bending over ledgers in the particular slant of north-facing windows that was best for reading columns of figures without making errors. She told him about her parents, her mother who laughed easily, and her father who had worked the docks and had large, gentle hands, and a way of telling stories that made ordinary days sound like something worth remembering. She told him about the boarding house where she had lived after the shop closed, 6 women sharing a kitchen, the landlord who had sold the building and given them all 6 weeks to find somewhere else. And then I saw the advertisement, she said, in a newspaper someone had left on the table. Mail order bride, Montana territory. A man who needs a partner more than he knows. That last part sounds like Dot. It was extraordinarily persuasive. Something moved in her face that was close to humor and then was gone. I told myself it was practical. A new start in a new place. I did not let myself think too much about what I might find when I arrived, because you already knew it might not be what Dot described. Because hope is fragile, she said simply, and I had not had much practice with it in some years, and I did not want to break it before the journey was over. I thought if I kept moving, I would arrive somewhere before the hope ran out. He looked at her for a long time. The train back on Tuesday, he said. Yes, you could stay through Tuesday. She waited. No pressure, he said, and the words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. The words of a man navigating territory he has not visited in a long time. Just the food here is better than the boarding house, and I owe you at least a few decent meals before you go. She looked at him steadily. He could not read what was in her face, whether it was hope or caution or simply the careful assessment of a woman who has made decisions based on insufficient information before and has learned from the experience. All right, she said. Through Tuesday. He nodded. He rose. He went upstairs and lay back down and listened to the house until her footsteps on the stairs told him she had gone back up as well. Then he lay in the silence for a long time with his hands behind his head and the curious sensation of a man who set out to do one straightforward thing and has ended up somewhere entirely different with no clear map home, and for the first time in 3 years, not entirely certain he wants one. What Ezra Whitfield did not know, lying in the dark of that September night, was that this was the last ordinary night either of them would have for a very long time. 2 miles south of the ranch line, on land that had been in the Garner family since 1868, a man named Silas Garner was sitting in a well-appointed study with a lamp burning and a document spread across his desk, reading about a proposed railroad survey and finding on the 3rd page 2 words that made him reach immediately for his pen. Silver Creek. The words were underlined before he had finished reading the sentence. 14 miles north, in the house with the 2 white crosses on the hill, a woman in a borrowed chair was beginning very carefully to think that the morning after this one might be worth looking forward to, and the man in the room above her was doing the same thing, which was something he had not done in 3 winters, and did not yet have a name for, and would not have a name for until the morning came, and with it the 2nd day and the 3rd, and the choice he did not know yet he was going to make. The Montana dark held the house in its enormous quiet. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and somewhere in the distance, moving westward through the night with its cargo of futures not yet decided, the last train whistle faded until it was gone entirely, and then there was nothing but the sound of the grass moving in the wind and the creek at the bottom of the hill, and 2 people in a house, both lying very still, listening to the particular silence of a life that is standing at a threshold and has not yet decided whether to step across. The 2nd morning came with frost. Not the killing frost of November, not the kind that takes the last of the garden and leaves the ground iron hard until April, but the early September kind that arrives before dawn and covers everything in a thin silver coat and burns off by mid-morning, leaving the world looking briefly laundered as though the night had made a quiet effort to start things clean. Ezra came downstairs before the sun was fully over the mountains and found the kitchen already warm, coffee already made, and Nora Voss standing at the stove in Eleanor's apron, turning bacon in the cast iron pan with the focused attention of someone performing a task they have decided to do correctly. He had noticed the apron the moment he stepped through the doorway. Eleanor's apron. The one that had hung on the hook beside the stove since the winter of '72. He had not moved it. He had not washed it. He had simply left it where she had last placed it, the way you leave certain things exactly where they are, because moving them would require making a decision you are not yet prepared to make. Nora had seen it. She had taken it down. She had put it on. He understood without needing to discuss it that she had looked at the apron and understood what it was and had made a quiet decision about it, and that the decision was the right one. She was not wearing it carelessly. She was wearing it the way you handle something borrowed from someone who mattered, with attention and with care. He said nothing. "You are up early," he said instead. "I am always up early." The bookkeeping office opened at 7 and the walk was 20 minutes. She did not turn around. "Sit down. Eggs will be ready in a moment." He sat down. It was strange, sitting at a table where someone else was cooking. Strange in a way that was not unpleasant, which was itself unsettling. He had eaten alone for 3 years. Meals that were fuel and nothing more, prepared without thought and consumed without attention. Because the act of cooking for one person in a kitchen built for more had always felt like a particular kind of arithmetic he did not want to keep doing. He had stopped tasting food somewhere in that first winter. Nora set the plate in front of him and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. And the simple symmetry of 2 people eating together in the morning light felt like something he had not realized he was missing until its sudden reappearance made the missing retroactively visible, the way you only understand how dark a room has been once someone opens a window. "I would like to see the rest of the ranch today," she said, "if that is acceptable." He looked at her. "Why?" She set down her coffee cup with the patience of someone who has encountered this particular question before and finds it only mildly exasperating. "Because I am here until Tuesday, and I do not like to be idle. Because Dorothy described a working cattle operation, and I have seen the house and the kitchen, and I would like to see the rest. Because I think it would be useful to understand what I have been brought out here to participate in, even if my participation turns out to be temporary." She picked up the cup again. "I am not asking to be entertained. I am asking to understand." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once and went back to his eggs. Gideon was at the barn when they saddled up an hour later. Ezra introduced Nora to the gray mare named Patience, who had been Eleanor's horse and was now the gentlest animal on the property, a horse that had learned over many years to read the particular quality of a rider's uncertainty and make allowances for it. Nora approached Patience the way she seemed to approach most things, directly and without performance. She offered her hand for the mare to smell, then ran her palm along the animal's neck with a quiet competence that told Ezra she had spent time around horses before. Not a great deal of time, but enough. "You have ridden," he said. "My father worked near a stable when I was young. The owners were generous with the quieter horses." She fitted her foot into the stirrup and swung up with the careful economy of someone working around an inconvenience she had decided not to mention. "I am not elegant about it, but I stay on." They rode out across the north pasture in the cool morning air, and Ezra found himself doing something he had not done in years, explaining the ranch, the land. The way the creek ran underground for half a mile before surfacing again near the eastern fence line. The box canyon to the north where they sheltered the herd during blizzards. The high meadow that bloomed with wildflowers in June and drew deer and elk and occasionally a mountain lion that had to be discouraged from the calves with considerable patience and a rifle. Nora listened with the quality of attention she gave to everything, thorough and unhurried, asking questions that were specific and practical and occasionally revealed an intelligence that surprised him, not because he had doubted it, but because he had not yet fully calibrated the precise degree of it. "How many head do you run?" "About 280, down from 320 last spring. I lost 38 to a late cold snap in the south pasture." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "The south pasture runs to where, exactly?" "To the fence line along what Silas Garner chooses to call Garner Creek, which is not Garner Creek by any legal definition, whatever the man himself prefers." She looked at him sideways. "Silas Garner, my neighbor to the south. Large operation. Ambitious man." He said it flatly, as a statement of observable fact without the particular edge that would have come into his voice a month ago. "Ambitious in which direction?" "In the direction of everything he does not currently own." She filed this away without comment, the way she filed most things, quietly and completely, without needing to announce that she had done so. Has he caused trouble before? He caused considerable trouble for the Dawson family 2 years ago. A water rights dispute that had more to do with pressure than with law. They sold and moved on. He has not pushed directly against me. Yet. The words settled between them for a moment before the wind carried it off across the grass. They were checking the north fence line when the sky changed. It happened the way it always happened in Montana, without transition or warning. The blue going gray, and then dark gray, and then the smell of rain arriving ahead of the rain itself, like a messenger sent to announce what was coming. Ezra looked up, read the distance and the color of the clouds, and said without urgency, "There is a line shack a 1/4 mile east. We should move." They moved. They made it with perhaps 30 seconds to spare before the sky opened. The line shack was small, barely 12 feet square, with a plank floor and a cast iron stove and a narrow cot and a shelf of basic supplies that Ezra restocked each spring against the possibility of exactly this kind of afternoon. He got the stove lit while Nora wrung water from the hem of her gray-blue dress and surveyed the accommodations with the expression of a person taking a realistic inventory of a situation. "Well," she said, "it keeps the rain out." "That is an optimistic description of the roof. But I take your point." The rain came down in sheets against the single small window. The stove began to throw heat. The shack contracted around them in the way small spaces do in bad weather, pulling the two people inside toward the center simply by virtue of there being nowhere else reasonably to stand. Ezra was aware of her nearness with an attention he had not directed at another person in 3 years. He recognized it, and he did not trust it, and he kept his eyes on the stove. "Tell me about Eleanor's garden," Nora said. He looked at her. "I noticed the plot behind the house. It has not been planted in some time, but the layout is deliberate. Someone planned it carefully. She grew vegetables in summer, herbs. She tried tomatoes once, but the season is too short here." He paused. "She planted roses along the south wall of the house. They did not survive the winter after she died." "Did you let them die?" He considered the question. It was the kind of question that has 2 answers, the true one and the comfortable one, and Nora Voss did not strike him as a woman who would accept the comfortable one without noticing the difference. "I did not prevent it," he said. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "The curtains in the front room are also hers." "Yes." You have kept everything exactly as it was. The house runs efficiently. But that is not why you kept it." He was quiet for a moment. The rain hammered the roof. The stove ticked as the metal expanded in the heat. "No," he said finally. "It is not." She did not press further. Outside, lightning whitened the window for a moment, and then the thunder rolled through, and the rain intensified, and the shack held them both in its small and particular warmth. "I have been thinking about the record books," Nora said. The shift in subject was abrupt enough that he turned to look at her directly. "What about them?" "You told me Gideon keeps the herd count by pasture, monthly records. He reviews them. I looked them over. Could I look at them when we get back?" He studied her. "Why?" She looked at him with the straightforward patience of someone who has learned that the question why is usually just a slower version of the question yes. "Because I kept accounts for a bookkeeping office for 4 years. Because I can read numbers and I can see patterns in numbers. And because the way you describe the South Pasture situation with Garner suggests to me that the most useful thing I could possibly do in the next 2 days is understand your records well enough to know whether there is anything in them that could be used against you." She held his gaze. "I am here until Tuesday. I might as well be useful." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "you can look at them." The ride back through the clearing rain was quiet in a different way than the morning silence had been. That had been the quiet of two people still working out what they were to each other. This was something slightly more settled. The quiet of two people who have taken a step in the same direction without formally discussing it and are now finding their stride. That evening, while Ezra sat across the kitchen table and made a reasonable effort to appear interested in a land survey report, Nora worked through 3 months of Gideon's ledger entries with a sharpness and efficiency that made Gideon himself, who came in after supper to collect his pipe, stop in the doorway and watch with an expression of quiet reassessment. After he left, she looked up. "Your South Pasture count from August is short." "How short?" 12 head against the July count. Gideon's notes show no sales and no recorded losses. Ezra set down the survey report. "Show me." She turned the ledger and pointed. He looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was not quite anger and not quite worry, but was the specific alertness of a man who has just heard a sound he does not like in a place where everything should be quiet. "I will speak with Gideon in the morning. There is something else." She pulled a folded piece of paper from beside the ledger and spread it on the table. Her handwriting was small and precise. Columns of numbers with dates and locations and careful notations in the margins. "I have been keeping my own count since I arrived. When we rode out this morning, I counted the South Pasture from the ridge." He looked at the paper, then at her. "Your July count shows 108 head. I counted 93 this morning." The kitchen was very quiet. He did not sleep well that night, but for different reasons than the night before. Gideon confirmed the discrepancy the following morning with a face that had gone tight around the edges. They had assumed some natural drift, the way you always assume drift before you look closely enough to see it as something else. 15 head gone from the South Pasture over 6 weeks, in numbers small enough to be overlooked if you were not keeping careful count. "Someone who knows our rotation," Gideon said. "Someone who knows when the South Pasture runs light on riders," Ezra said. Neither of them said Garner's name. They did not need to. 3 days later, Silas Garner came to call. He came with 3 riders, which was 2 more than a neighborly visit required. He came wearing the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed a conversation and is confident he already knows how it ends. He was a large man, not tall but wide through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that comes from decades of getting what he wanted, and the resulting assumption that this would simply continue. His beard was trimmed with a neatness that seemed slightly out of place on a working ranch. His coat was better quality than the work required. Ezra met him in the yard. Nora came out of the house and stood at the top of the porch steps without being asked. Ezra noticed this and said nothing. Whitfield. Garner's voice was the voice of a man who makes offers rather than requests. Heard you had some company arrive. Mail order arrangement, they tell me in town. What do you need, Garner? Just a neighborly conversation. Garner looked around the yard with the easy survey of a man taking inventory of something he is considering acquiring. Water rights, mainly. You are running stock close to my creek line. I have paperwork suggesting those rights revert under the 69 agreement. The 69 agreement gives this ranch prior use going back to the foundation survey. You are welcome to dispute that in court. Garner smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes, which were engaged in the particular kind of calculation that occurs when a man has already identified what he wants and is locating the most efficient pressure points. His gaze moved to Nora. This would be the young woman from Philadelphia. His tone carried something beneath its surface cordiality, something dismissive and measuring at the same time. The tone of a man who has already decided that a woman standing on a ranch porch in a borrowed apron is not a factor that requires serious consideration. Long way from home, aren't you? Miss Nora came down the porch steps. She walked across the yard with a calm and deliberate pace and stopped at a point where she was standing between Ezra and Garner's horse, a position that Garner clearly had not anticipated. And she stood there with her hands at her sides and her head tilted slightly upward to look at him, and her expression carrying nothing dramatic. No anger, no performance. Only the focused attention of a woman who has decided that this conversation needs to go somewhere different than the direction it is currently heading. Mr. Garner. Her voice was level and entirely pleasant. I keep the accounts for this ranch. I have reviewed the land records and the water rights documentation going back to the original survey. The prior use claim on this water source is clear, properly dated, and witnessed by two parties still living in this county. If you have paperwork suggesting otherwise, I would be genuinely interested to see the date on it. She paused for the length of one measured breath. I would also be interested to know whether your herd count along the south pasture line reflects the same 15 head we appear to be missing from ours over the past 6 weeks. The yard was very quiet. Garner's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Nora to Ezra and back to Nora with the recalculating expression of a man who went fishing for something predictable and found something else entirely on the end of the line. Spirited, he said, and he made the word small and slightly condescending in the way that men sometimes do when a woman has said something they cannot immediately counter and need a moment to find a different angle. Accurate, Nora replied. Whitfield. Garner looked away from her with the deliberate casualness of a man reasserting where his attention is owed. Think carefully about what you are doing here. A man in your position, running a spread this size, bringing in a woman from the city. It complicates things. He let the word complicate carry weight it was not being asked to carry openly. I am still in a friendly mood. These conversations go differently once that changes. Then I suggest, Ezra said, and his voice had gone to the particular quiet that men who have spent years working alone sometimes develop. A quiet that has more weight in it than volume, that you take the friendly mood home with you and keep it there. Garner held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned his horse and rode out, his 3 men following, and the yard was quiet again with the specific quality of quiet that follows a conversation that has not ended but has only been postponed to a later date. Gideon appeared from the barn doorway. He looked at Nora, then at Ezra, then back at Nora, with the expression of a man who has been keeping a running estimate of something and has just revised it considerably upward. "That went well," Gideon said. "No, it did not," Nora said. "But it needed to happen." She turned and walked back to the house. As she passed Ezra, she said quietly, without slowing, "He is going to cut the south fence." She was right. They found it 3 nights later. 40 feet of fence line down along the southern boundary. Clean cuts that had nothing to do with wear or weather or the honest deterioration of materials over time. 11 more had gone from the south pasture. Gone in the night. Moved by people who knew exactly where to go and exactly how long they had before anyone came to check. Ezra stood at the cut fence in the early morning light and looked at the clean edges of the wire and felt the cold, specific anger of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed at a cost he should not have had to pay. That evening, Gideon came in from town with news that landed on the kitchen table like a stone dropped into still water. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, which was the thing Gideon did when he was carrying information he was not entirely certain how to deliver. "There is talk in town," he said, "about a railroad survey. A new trunk line coming through this part of the territory. Inside 2 years, they are saying." Ezra looked up from the harness he was mending. Nora looked up from the ledger. "Through Silver Creek?" Ezra asked. "Right through the middle of it. Town will triple in 5 years if it comes through. Land along that line is going to be worth 3 times what it is worth today. Maybe more." Gideon set his hat on the table. The silence that followed had a particular texture. The silence of people assembling pieces that have been lying separate and now suddenly, without warning, arrange themselves into a shape that is entirely recognizable. "Garner knows," Nora said. It was not a question. "He has been in and out of the county seat 3 times in the past month," Gideon said. "His foreman has been asking questions about survey routes." Nora set down her pen. She looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of someone thinking several moves ahead of the current position. The way a chess player looks at a board, not as it is, but as it is about to become. "He is not trying to drive us out over water rights," she said. "He is trying to acquire as much land along the survey route as possible before the announcement makes it too expensive. He needs the smaller ranches gone before the land values shift." "That changes things," Ezra said. "It changes everything." Nora stood up and went to the shelf where she kept her correspondence paper and pulled out several sheets. She sat back down and began to write quickly in the small and precise handwriting that Ezra had come to recognize as the outward sign of her thinking fast and with complete intention. "What are you writing?" "Letters to the other ranchers along this line." She did not look up. The pen moved with the decisiveness of someone who knows exactly what they mean to say. If Garner wants all of us gone, then all of us should know about it. And if all of us know about it, then he has considerably more opposition than he calculated for. He watched her write. She had been in this house for 4 weeks now. In that time, she had reorganized the pantry, spoken with every man on the ranch by name, and remembered everything each of them had told her, spotted a 15-head discrepancy in the South pasture records, faced down Silas Garner in the front yard, predicted the fence cutting before it happened, and was now writing letters at 10 o'clock at night on behalf of 11 families she had never met. He did not have a name for what that was, but he recognized it as something he had not encountered in a very long time, and he was, without having consciously decided to be, deeply reluctant to see it stop. "I will ride to the Aldrich place in the morning," he said. "Gideon can cover the South Valley ranches. Callum can ride the north. I have written to 12 families." She straightened the stack of letters. "I want to write 2 more before I sleep. The meeting should be here, not in town. Holt will hear about it either way, but I would rather he hear about it after." He went to bed. And at some point well past midnight, he heard her footsteps on the stairs, quiet and unhurried, and the house settled around them both in the particular silence of a place that has, almost without anyone noticing, begun to feel inhabited again. What Ezra Whitfield did not know, lying in the dark that October night, was that 2 miles south on land that had been in the Garner family since 1868, a letter had arrived that afternoon from Chicago. A letter written in the careful and specific language of men who have done this kind of work before, and understand that the details are where the difference between success and exposure tends to live. The letter was from a man named Warren Holt. He represented a company called Donovan and Associates, which had done very well in Wyoming and Colorado by moving early and moving quietly. He had a contact in the territorial capital who sent him survey reports before they were made public. He had, on his desk in Chicago, a list of 12 independent ranches along the proposed Silver Creek route that had not yet been approached, and that would, if acquired at current prices before the public announcement, represent what he described in his private correspondence as an extraordinary return. He had written to Silas Garner. It was a long letter. Garner read it twice. Then he called for his foreman and began to give instructions. The quiet and methodical instructions of a man who has already decided how something ends and is simply working backward from the conclusion. 14 miles north, in the house with the 2 white crosses on the hill, a woman was finishing the last of her letters and folding them carefully and setting them in a neat stack to be sent in the morning. And the man upstairs was lying in the dark with the curious and unfamiliar sensation of someone who set out to do one simple thing and ended up somewhere entirely different without a map, and for the first time in 3 years, not entirely certain he wants one. The Montana night held the ranch in its enormous quiet. Somewhere in the distance, moving east through the darkness, a lone rider carried a sealed letter toward the county seat. And along 14 miles of grassland between the mountains and the creek, 12 families slept without knowing that by morning they would each receive a letter written in small, precise handwriting by a woman from Philadelphia who had arrived in their territory with 17 cents in her pocket and had decided, quietly and without announcement, that this valley and the people in it were worth protecting. The night she asked him the question he had been afraid of, the fire had burned down to coals. Ezra had heard her footsteps on the stairs sometime past midnight, quiet and careful, the particular sound of a person moving through a house they have learned well enough not to disturb it. He lay still for 10 minutes in the dark. Then he rose and pulled on his clothes and went down. She was in the chair by the cold fireplace, shawl around her shoulders, auburn hair loose around her face, hands folded in her lap, looking out the front window at the darkness that was complete and absolute and entirely different from the darkness of cities, which is never really dark at all. The coals threw just enough light to see by. He sat in the chair across from her and said nothing, and she said nothing. And for a while they simply sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill the air between them with the sound of their own voices. Then she turned and looked at him. "I want to ask you something," she said. And I want you to know that I am asking it because I think it matters, not because I want to cause pain." He waited. "Do you think Eleanor would want you to live the way you have been living?" She said it gently, but she said it directly, the way Nora Voss said everything that she had decided needed to be said. Not the ranch, not the work, the other part. The part where the house gets very clean and the man inside it stops taking up the space he used to fill. The part where no one comes in and no one leaves, and 3 years go by and the roses die and no one plants anything new. The coals shifted. A small sound in the silence. "Eleanor was not a woman who would want that," Nora said softly. "The woman who chose those curtains and organized that kitchen and laughed at you for turning red when she asked for water for her horse. She was not a woman who loved small. And people who love large do not want the people they loved to make themselves smaller in the name of remembering them." "You did not know her," Ezra said, but his voice had lost its edge. "No. But I know the house she made, and I know what a house looks like when it has been loved into existence by someone who intended it to be lived in." She paused. "She would have wanted you to keep going, not because the grief was wrong, but because she loved you large enough to want more for you than an empty house and a clean kitchen and a man sitting very still inside it, waiting for something he has stopped believing will come." Ezra stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the Montana dark, the shapes of the barn and the outbuildings visible against the lesser darkness of the sky, and beyond them, the hill where the 2 white crosses stood in the night, patient and permanent. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing he had not said to anyone, the thing he had not said out loud even to himself, in the dark, in the room upstairs, in the 3 years of nights he had lain awake with it. "If I keep living," he said, "if I let things change and let time move and let the house become something different from what it was, then it means I have accepted it. It means I have agreed that they are gone and that the world goes on regardless." He did not turn around. "And I am not certain I am willing to do that." The fire gave a small sound, the coals settling. Nora's voice, when it came, was careful with the weight it was carrying. "Or," she said, "it means you are brave enough to live with the fact that they are gone and the world goes on regardless, and to find that those 2 things, the grief and the living, are not enemies of each other, that you can carry one and still do the other, that carrying it is not the same as accepting it in the way you mean." He stood at the window for a long time. The darkness outside did not change, but something in the quality of the silence behind him did, a very slight shift, like a door that has been held shut by considerable effort and has begun almost imperceptibly to open. "She would have liked you," he said finally, still looking out. Nora said nothing. "She was stubborn in the same direction you are," he said. "She asked questions that had 2 answers and waited for the true one. She did not accept the comfortable version of things." A pause. "She would have recognized you." The room was very quiet after that. Nora looked at her hands in her lap. When she looked up, something in her face was open in a way it had not been entirely open before, the composed and careful surface of it permitting just briefly something underneath to show. "My mother used to say," she said, "that happiness is not measured by how long you hold it. It is measured by how deeply you feel it while it is yours." She and my father had 20 years. She said those 20 years were worth a lifetime of lesser love. Ezra turned from the window. He looked at her across the room in the low light of the cooling coals. This woman who had arrived with 17 cents and 1 tear quickly erased, and the stubborn composure of someone who had been knocked down enough times to become very efficient at standing back up, who had looked at Eleanor's curtains and known immediately they were not his choices, who spoke the language. He sat back down in the chair across from her, and they talked until the coals went entirely dark and the first gray light began at the edges of the window, and neither of them suggested stopping. 3 days after that conversation, Gideon rode back from town with his hat in his hands, and the specific expression he reserved for news arriving faster than expected. Warren Holt was in Silver Creek. He had arrived quietly, in a good coat, on a well-kept horse, with a leather satchel of documents, and the practiced ease of a man who has learned that the most effective way to enter a room is as though the room had already been expecting him. He had taken a room at the boarding house. He had spent his first evening reading papers. By the following morning, he was at the table in Murphy's saloon with 3 of the smaller ranch owners from the South Valley, and the documents spread before him were precise and the numbers were generous. "Double the current market value," Gideon said. "Cash settlement in 30 days. No conditions. Patterson signed before noon. 2 others by the end of the day." Nora heard about the 3rd man from his wife, who came to the ranch on the pretense of returning a borrowed pot and stayed for 2 hours because what she actually needed was someone to tell her whether her husband had done the right thing. Nora gave her tea and a realistic assessment and sent her home with 3 jars of preserves and a clearer picture of what was at stake. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote 8 letters in 2 hours. Each one addressed to a different ranch owner along the survey route. Each one different in its particulars but identical in its essential message. Something is happening that affects all of us, and it will go better if we face it together rather than separately. Ezra came in from the south fence at dusk and found her still writing. "Holt is in town," she said without looking up. "Gideon told me. 3 signatures today." She finished the letter she was on and set it aside and picked up the next blank sheet. They were offered double market value, cash in 30 days. "It is a very good offer," she said, "if you do not know what the land will be worth in 18 months. And if you do know, then it is an excellent offer for Donovan and Associates, and a very poor one for anyone who accepts it." She looked up at him. "We need to call a meeting. Not next week. This week." He studied her face in the lamplight, the focused precision of her expression, the way she was holding 2 things at once, the urgency and the steadiness. And he thought, not for the first time, about how 3 years of living alone had made him forget what it was to share the weight of a problem with someone genuinely capable of carrying half of it. "I will ride to the Aldrich place in the morning," he said. "Gideon can cover the South Valley ranches. Callum can ride the north. I have written to 12 families." She straightened the stack of letters. "I want to write 2 more before I sleep. The meeting should be here, not in town. Holt will hear about it either way, but I would rather he hear about it after." He went to bed, and sometime well past midnight he heard her footsteps on the stairs, and the house settled around them both. They came from 14 ranches. They came on horseback and by wagon, and in one case on foot, a man named Aldrich who lived close enough to walk and preferred to on the grounds that horses were an unnecessary complication in a world that already contained sufficient complications. They filled the main room of the Whitfield house and spilled onto the porch and stood in the yard, men and women both, with the particular quality of attention that people bring to meetings where something important is about to be either lost or saved, and they have not yet determined which. Nora stood at the front of the room with a map she had drawn herself across 3 evenings at the kitchen table, precise and annotated, showing the proposed survey route and the current ownership of the land along it, and the pattern of Garner's existing holdings, and the 3 ranches that had already signed with Donovan and Associates. Silas Garner was there. He had been invited because Nora had insisted, over Ezra's measured objection, that the invitation be extended. "If he comes, we know where he is," she had said. "If he does not come, we know he has already made his decision. Either way, we have more information than we had before." Garner came. He sat in the back corner with his arms folded and the expression of a man attending a performance he has already read the script for. Reed Garner sat on the opposite side of the room. This was noticed by everyone and remarked upon by no one, which in a community of people who remarked upon everything was itself a form of comment. Nora spoke for 20 minutes without notes. She described what she knew about the survey route and what she had been able to determine about Donovan and Associates from their acquisition pattern in Wyoming and Colorado. She explained the mathematics of land value before and after a railroad announcement in terms that were concrete and specific and left very little room for optimistic reinterpretation. She described what cooperation between the ranches along the route could accomplish. Both in terms of economic stability and in terms of presenting a consolidated front to buyers who relied entirely on isolated and uninformed sellers. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to emotion. She simply laid the situation out with the clarity of someone who has thought carefully about how to present a complex thing to people who need to understand it quickly and act on it correctly. When she finished, Aldrich raised his hand. The old rancher who had walked from his spread and whose opinion carried the particular weight of someone who had survived in this valley for 30 years through things that were supposed to finish him. "I have been ranching this ground since before some of you were born," he said. "I have seen railroad men and land agents and speculators come through here with their good coats and their careful numbers. I have seen what happens to the ones who take the deal and to the ones who do not." He paused. "I have never seen anyone lay it out this plain. I think we should listen to her." Garner unfolded his arms. "She is not from here," he said. The observation was addressed to the room rather than to Nora directly. "She has been in this territory for less than 2 months. She is telling us what to do with land that our families have worked for years." "Mr. Garner," Nora's voice was pleasant, "I have been here long enough to understand what this land is worth to the people who work it. That is the only qualification the argument requires." She held his gaze with the calm attention of a woman who has looked at harder things than Silas Garner and not looked away. "If you have a counter-proposal, I invite you to share it." Garner said nothing. Reed Garner, from his side of the room, looked at his father with an expression that contained several things, exhaustion being perhaps the most prominent. The vote was 11-3 in favor of forming an association, the Cattlemen's Association of Silver Creek. That evening, after the last wagon had rolled out of the yard and Gideon had gone to the bunkhouse and Callum had gone to check the south fence and the house was quiet, Ezra found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Nora put away the last of the cups that had been used and washed and dried with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. She had been in this house 6 weeks. He had arrived at the train station in Silver Creek with a practice speech and an envelope and a plan that was simple and clean and entirely beside the point of what was going to happen. And somewhere between the platform and this kitchen and 14 ranches represented at his table, and a woman who had faced down Silas Garner in his front yard and then come inside and written letters until midnight, the plan had become irrelevant. He did not say any of this. Instead, when she turned and found him in the doorway and looked at him with the green eyes that were tired now, genuinely tired, not the managed composure of the first days, but the honest exhaustion of someone who has given a great deal in a short time, he crossed the kitchen and stood close enough that she would have to look up to see his face, and he said quietly, "You should know that I stopped thinking about Tuesday some time ago." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, careful and considering and not entirely surprised. "So did I," she said. "Some time ago." Neither of them said anything further. There was nothing further that needed to be said that night. But when she reached for the lamp to carry it upstairs, his hand was there first, and he carried it for her, and at the top of the landing he handed it back, and their hands touched in the exchange. Briefly, and the brief touch was the whole of it, and it was entirely sufficient. He went to his room. She went to hers. The house settled into its night sounds around them both. And outside, in the dark, 2 miles south on Garner land, a letter from Warren Holt had arrived that afternoon with a single word underlined 3 times near the bottom of the last page: escalate. The 4 riders appeared on the main track at 9:30 in the morning, coming up slow from the south in the particular way that men come when they have decided in advance how a conversation will go and are not expecting to be surprised by the response. Nora saw them from the kitchen window. She set down her pen. She looked at them the way she looked at numbers that did not add up, carefully and without rushing to a conclusion, reading what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. 4 men, trail-worn clothes, not ranch-worn. The specific distinction between a man who moves through hard country and a man who works in it. The one in front rode slightly ahead of the others, with the flat and evaluating eyes of someone in a profession that required the removal of personal feeling from professional action some time ago, and had not found occasion to restore it. Ezra had left for town an hour earlier. The first formal meeting of the Cattlemen's Association of Silver Creek, held at Murphy's Saloon, with the basic framework of how the association would function to be established and agreed upon. He had said he would be back before noon. Nora looked at the clock on the kitchen shelf. Then she looked back at the 4 men on the track. She went to the cabinet where the rifle was kept. She had been practicing since her 3rd week at the ranch. Every morning before breakfast at the fence post targets Ezra had set up behind the barn with the patient practicality of a man who understood that his wife's ability to defend herself and her home was not a vanity project, but a straightforward necessity, like keeping the well clean or the roof sound. She was not, as she had told Ezra with complete honesty, elegant about it, but she was accurate. She had worked at the accuracy the way she worked at everything, methodically and without complaint, until it was reliable. She checked the load. Then she went to the side window of the kitchen, the one that looked toward the barn, and she knocked twice on the frame, the signal she and Callum Prairie had established in the 2nd week without being asked to by anyone, because Nora Voss was the kind of person who established contingency arrangements before she needed them. Callum appeared in the barn doorway. She pointed toward the roof with 2 fingers, then toward the main track. He looked. He understood. He disappeared back into the barn, and she heard faintly the sound of him moving toward the ladder at the far end. She opened the front door and walked out onto the porch. The 4 men pulled up at the gate. The one in front looked at her with the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned that visible intention tends to complicate the early stages of a conversation. "Ma'am?" His voice was conversational, the tone of a man explaining something reasonable. "We represent a business interest that has some concern about the recent meeting held at this property. We are here to have a conversation." "You are welcome to have a conversation," Nora said. "From there." The man looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her, then at the rifle again, with the expression of someone making a rapid and slightly inconvenient recalculation. "There is no need for that. I am comfortable with it here." "Go ahead." The man shifted in his saddle. Behind him, the other three sat their horses with the stillness of people who are waiting for a signal they have already agreed upon. "You are alone out here," he said. His voice had not changed. That was the particular quality of it that Nora had identified in the first 30 seconds. It was designed not to change, designed to stay pleasant and reasonable regardless of what was actually being communicated beneath the pleasantness. "I am not alone," Nora said. She said it without looking away from the four men at her gate, without looking toward the barn roof or toward the eastern fence line where the two riders from the neighboring Prairie spread, who had been mending shared boundary fence that morning and who had received a note through the youngest Prairie boy 40 minutes ago, had now positioned themselves at the corner of the outbuilding with their rifles at rest. Callum Pryor stood up on the barn roof. The man in front looked at Callum, then at the two riders at the outbuilding, then back at Nora on the porch, who had not moved and had not changed her expression and was holding the rifle with the specific quality of stillness that distinguishes a person who is performing readiness from one who actually possesses it. He settled his hat. "We will carry your regards to our employer," he said. "Please do, and please tell him that this ranch has 11 neighbors who will hear about this visit before nightfall. This valley has been here a long time. His employer has been here 3 weeks. The arithmetic of that situation should be clear enough without further explanation." They rode out. Nora stood on the porch and watched them until they rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. Then she went back inside and set the rifle against the wall beside the door and sat down at the kitchen table and placed both hands flat on the surface in front of her. Her hands were shaking. She sat with that for a moment. She did not try to stop it or reason it away or convert it into something more manageable. She simply let it be what it was, the body's honest account of what had just happened, rendered without apology and without pretense. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. She was on the 3rd page when she heard the wagon in the yard. Ezra came through the front door and stopped. He read the room. He read it the way he read weather, from small signs assembled quickly into a complete picture. The rifle against the wall, which he had left in the cabinet. The quality of stillness in the house. Something in the set of Nora's shoulders that was composed, carefully and deliberately composed, over something that had required composing. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him plainly and in the correct order, the way she reported everything, without dramatizing and without minimizing, beginning with the moment she saw them from the kitchen window and ending with the moment they rode around the bend. She told him about the note to the Prairie riders, about Callum on the roof. When she finished, Ezra was quiet. The quality of his quiet was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling at a very high concentration, compressed into stillness, the way heat compresses into a coal before it becomes flame. He crossed the kitchen. He took her by the shoulders and held her with the careful and fierce steadiness of a man who has spent 3 years understanding at a cellular level what it means to lose someone and is feeling, in this specific moment, the full weight of that understanding applied to the present. She pressed her face against his shoulder and let him hold her and felt the last of the tension in her own body finally release, the way a thing held tightly for a long time releases when it is permitted to. "You sent for Callum before they reached the gate," he said against her hair. "I sent for Callum before they came around the last bend in the track. I had 40 minutes. He held her for another moment. Then he stepped back and looked at her face directly. The face of a woman who had stood alone on a porch with 4 armed men at the gate and had not moved back a single step. "You are the most capable person I have ever known," he said. "I was frightened." "I know. That is precisely what I mean." The meeting of the Cattlemen's Association 2 days later was the largest gathering Silver Creek had seen since the fire of '73. 17 ranches represented. Ranch wives present and seated alongside their husbands, which was not the established custom and which nobody commented upon because Nora Whitfield had walked into Murphy's saloon first and sat down, and the precedent had therefore been set before anyone had fully processed whether they intended to observe it. Warren Holt was not present. His absence was felt the way a storm is felt in the pressure drop that precedes it. Silas Garner was present. Reed Garner was present, sitting where he had sat at the meeting at the Whitfield Ranch, on the side of the room that was not his father's side. The distance between them was perhaps 15 feet, and was noticed by everyone in the room and mentioned by no one. The formal business of the association had been completed. The room was moving toward adjournment when Reed stood up. He was 24 years old, and he had his father's physical breadth and none of his father's ease in a room full of people, which in this particular moment was not a disadvantage. He stood with the specific discomfort of a man who has made a decision that is going to cost him something considerable, and has decided the cost is worth paying, and is now standing on the far edge of having said so out loud, where there is no longer any possibility of retreat. "I have something to say," Reed said, "to all of you. Not to my father in particular, though he is welcome to hear it." The room went quiet. Silas Garner, in his corner, went very still. "I led the riders who cut the south fence on the Whitfield property in September." Reed's voice was steady. "Both times. I moved cattle from their south pasture on 3 separate occasions over 6 weeks. I did this on the instruction of my father, whose purpose was to create the appearance of a ranch in financial difficulty and thereby reduce the price at which it could be acquired." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at the room. "I am telling you this because I am finished doing things that make me ashamed of myself by morning, and because you have a right to know what has been done to you and by whom and why." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when a room full of people absorbs the same information simultaneously, and the various responses to it have not yet sorted themselves into expression. Silas Garner stood up. He was a large man, and the room was not large, and when he stood, the space rearranged itself around him. He looked at his son across the 15 feet of floorboard between them. What passed between them in that look was not the drama as open confrontation. It was something older and quieter and considerably sadder than confrontation. Two people who have arrived at the place where a road divides and are standing at the fork and have understood, without needing to say it, that they are going to walk separate ways from this point forward. Garner picked up his hat. He walked toward the door. He did not look at Nora. He did not look at Ezra. He looked at Reed for one long final moment that contained, if you were watching with sufficient attention, something that was not quite an apology and not quite a farewell, but existed in the vicinity of both. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him, and the room released a breath it had been holding collectively for some time. Warren Holt left Silver Creek 3 days later. The letter he sent to Donovan and associates from the territorial capital described the situation in Silver Creek as presenting unfavorable acquisition conditions and recommended redirecting resources to properties in the northern district where, as he put it, the social organization is less developed. He was a practical man. He recognized when a position had become untenable. He did not waste time on untenable positions. And then the snow came. It came in the first week of November, the way winter comes to Montana, without ceremony and without apology, overnight and absolute. The world went white and stayed white. The work of keeping cattle alive in that whiteness became the full and consuming purpose of every day, from first light to last. Nora learned cattle work the way she learned everything, by doing it, by making mistakes in the first week that she cataloged carefully and did not make again, by asking Gideon and Callum questions with the directness that had become her established mode of operation and that both men had learned to answer with equal directness because any other approach was a waste of everyone's time. In the second week of December, on an evening when they had finished supper and the lamp was lit and the snow was falling thick and soft beyond the window, Ezra reached into his vest pocket and set a folded letter on the table between them. She looked at it. "Your mother's necklace is in Boston," he said. "I wrote to a broker there 3 weeks ago. The reply came this morning." He said it the way he said most things, directly and without ceremony. "I have arranged to have it sent. It should arrive within the month. You should not have had to sell it. That is not a debt you owed anyone." Nora looked at the letter for a long moment without speaking. When she looked up, her eyes were doing something they did not often do. "Ezra," she said, just his name. He looked at her steadily. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not through Tuesday or any other Tuesday after that. I would like you to stay, because this house has been a house again since September, and I do not know how to go back to what it was before. And I find that I do not want to." He paused. "I would like you to stay, because I have gotten very bad at wanting things. And I would rather be honest about wanting this than skilled at not wanting it." Nora looked at the letter, then at her hands, then at him. "I told myself on the train that I was being practical," she said, "that what I needed was a practical solution, a place, a purpose, stability." She paused. "I stopped believing that approximately the first morning. Since the bacon and the coffee and the way you refilled my plate without asking." She met his eyes. "All right," she said. "I will stay." He nodded once, in the way he received most important things, without visible drama and with complete intention. They were married the following week in the small wooden church in Silver Creek, with Gideon Briggs as witness and Callum Prairie crying openly in the third pew with the uncomplicated emotional freedom of a 22-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by feeling things in public. Dot arrived the morning of the ceremony from 2 counties over, appearing at the door with her traveling bag and an expression of complete and unrepentant vindication that she wore for the remainder of the day without apology. Nora wore the gray-blue dress that had carried her all the way from Philadelphia, freshly washed and pressed, because it was the dress she had arrived in, and it seemed right to be married in it. Ezra wore his blue work shirt and the brown leather vest he wore every day of his working life. The minister read the traditional words. When he asked if anyone objected, Ezra held Nora's hands and waited, with the vigilance of a man who has learned not to take uninterrupted good fortune entirely for granted. There was nothing. Only the wind through the church windows and Dot Whitfield sniffling into her handkerchief, and the particular silence of a room full of people who are watching something true happen and know enough to be quiet about it. She also discovered, in the 3rd week of November, that she was pregnant. She had been carrying the knowledge for 2 weeks while she determined how certain she was and considered how to say it. She considered the various approaches available to her and rejected the indirect ones because indirection had never served her well, and she did not expect it to begin doing so now. She told him on an evening when the snow was falling in the thick, soft way that muffles all sound and makes the world outside the window look like something remembered rather than something present. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp burning between them, the fire doing its work in the corner. The house settled into its evening sounds around them. She set down her cup and looked at him directly and said it. Ezra did not respond immediately. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the falling snow. His hands were at his sides. The set of his shoulders told her everything she needed to know about what was happening inside him, and she knew, with the precision of a woman who had been paying close attention to this man for 3 months, exactly what it was. Eleanor. The children she had lost before Henry. Then Henry himself. Then Eleanor. The winter of 72, which had not simply taken people he loved, but had taken the entire architecture of the future he had been building and left him with walls and no roof, and the long work of learning to live in an open structure. She waited. She did not fill the silence. She did not reach for him or speak reassurances she could not guarantee, or do any of the things that would have made the moment easier on the surface and less honest underneath. She simply sat at the table and let him have the time the moment required. After a long while, he turned around. His face had the look of a man who has been somewhere private and has come back from it still standing, not unaffected, not unchanged, but present. "If I lost you," he said. The sentence did not finish. It did not need to. "You are not going to lose me." She said it with the steadiness of a woman who cannot make it factually certain and is making it emotionally certain instead, which is the only kind of certainty that is genuinely available to people who love each other in a world that does not offer written guarantees. You cannot promise that. No, I cannot promise that. She stood up and crossed the kitchen and stood before him and put both hands flat against his chest and looked up at his face, the face she had been reading for 3 months and had come to know the way you come to know a landscape you have walked every day in every light, in every weather. "I can promise that I will not leave without a fight," she said. "I can promise that the same stubbornness that stood on that porch with 4 armed men at the gate will be applied with equal or greater force to everything that comes next." She held his gaze. "And I can promise you that the worst thing you can do right now is stand slightly outside of this, the way you have been standing slightly outside of things for 3 years. Because if you do that, you will miss it. And it is worth not missing." He looked at her for a long time. At this woman who had arrived at his train station with 17 cents and a pearl necklace already sold and 1 tear wiped away before anyone could see it. who had stood in his yard and faced Silas Garner without moving back, who had sat alone at a kitchen table with shaking hands and then picked up her pen and gone back to work, who had asked him the question he had been afraid of and waited in the dark for the true answer. Then he put his arms around her and held her with the particular gentleness of someone holding something that has become, without his fully intending to allow it, the most important thing in his world. "I love you," he said. The word came out with the weight of something that has been true for a long time and has finally been permitted to exist in the air between two people. "I know," she said against his shoulder. "I love you too." Outside, the snow came down in the particular silence of a Montana winter, deep and absolute and patient. The cottonwood on the hill stood bare above the two white crosses, its branches moving faintly in the wind that came down from the mountains. The house held them both in its warm and ordinary light, the light of a fire well tended and a lamp properly trimmed, and two people standing in a kitchen that had been too quiet for 3 years and was quiet no longer. And somewhere in the distance, in a study that was beginning to feel considerably larger than it had the previous month, Silas Garner sat alone at his desk in the dark and did not light the lamp, and the house around him echoed with the specific sound of a man who is confused acquiring things with building something and has arrived, too late in the evening to do much about it, at the understanding of the difference. The child came in March. He came at night, as these things often do, with a storm for company. The wind driving snow against the windows. The house shaking in gusts that rattled the panes in their frames with the persistence of something that wanted to be let in. Dot had arrived 2 days earlier from her home 2 counties over, appearing at the front door with her traveling bag and her particular expression of a woman who has been paying close attention and has determined that her presence is required. She had not been invited. She had not needed to be. The doctor came from town, summoned by Callum Prairie, who had saddled up in the dark and ridden through the worst of the storm without being asked, because the occasion had announced its own requirements clearly enough. Ezra did not go into the room. He sat in the hallway outside the door in the straight-backed chair that Eleanor had placed there years ago, because she had said that every house should have a chair in the hallway for the times when people need to sit down without going to the trouble of choosing a room. He had never moved it. In 3 years, he had walked past it every day without sitting in it. Tonight, he sat in it and understood for the first time why Eleanor had put it there. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he was, in the most accurate account of what was occurring inside him, more afraid than he had been at any point in 38 years of living in hard country. More afraid than the morning he found the south fence cut and the cattle gone. More afraid than the afternoon Nora told him about the 4 riders and he had read the room and understood what the rifle against the wall meant. More afraid than any physical danger he had navigated, because physical danger has a specific and external shape, and you can orient yourself against it and respond to it with your hands and your body and your accumulated knowledge of how to survive difficult things. What was happening behind this door had no shape he could orient against. He thought of Eleanor. He thought of Henry. He thought of Nora standing on the porch with the rifle and 4 men at the gate, and he held that image and tried to transfer its quality of steadiness to himself, and found that the transfer was incomplete. Dot came out at some point and put her hand on his shoulder without saying anything, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done, and then went back inside. And then the sound came. It came through the door, and through the noise of the storm, and through 3 years of silence, and 6 months of careful and earned and improbable happiness that had grown up in that silence the way certain things grow, quietly and without permission and entirely on their own terms. A child's cry, strong and insistent and entirely, unmistakably alive. The doctor opened the door. He was an old man who had delivered children in difficult circumstances many times over and had developed the professional steadiness of someone for whom extraordinary things had become routine. But even he was smiling. A boy, Mr. Whitfield. Healthy, loud, everything in the right place and the right number. Ezra stood up from the chair. He went into the room. Nora was propped against the pillows with the specific exhaustion of someone who has done the hardest work available to a human being and is fully aware of what they have accomplished. Her auburn hair was loose and dark with sweat. Her face was the color of something that has been through a serious ordeal and is still demonstrably itself, still recognizably and completely her. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in the white flannel that Dot had prepared. From the bundle came the sounds of a person who has very recently arrived somewhere new and has decided that vigorous complaint is the appropriate response to the transition. She looked at Ezra, the green eyes, unchanged by everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. "Come meet your son," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she shifted the bundle, and he looked down at a face that was new and red and already possessed of a fully formed opinion about things, the face of a person who had arrived with intentions. He put out one finger. The small hand found it and gripped it with a strength entirely disproportionate to its size, the absolute and uncomplicated grip of someone who has located something solid and has decided to hold on. Ezra Whitfield, who had not cried in 3 years, found that 3 years had been collecting something, and that the collection was now complete and required release. He let it go without fighting it, sitting on the edge of the bed in the room where Nora had slept since September, with his wife and his son, while the storm moved east and the room grew quiet around them. "What shall we call him?" Nora asked. He had been thinking about this since November, turning it over in the spaces between other thoughts, looking at it from different angles the way you look at a thing you want to get exactly right. "Henry William Whitfield," he said. He looked at her. "Henry for the boy I lost. William for your father. You told me his name was William." Nora's face did what faces do when something unexpected turns out to be exactly right. Something opened in it and then steadied, like a door blown wide by wind and then held gently in place. "Both their mothers," she said softly. The way she said it acknowledged everything that could not be said directly but needed to be recognized. All the people who were not in the room and were entirely present in it. "Both their mothers," he agreed. Dot was in the doorway with her handkerchief already in use and an expression of complete and unrepentant satisfaction on her face. Outside, the storm was settling into the quieter persistence of a system that has made its point and is now simply following through. And the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, full rather than empty, held rather than abandoned. When Nora and Henry William were both asleep and the storm had moved fully east and the sky had cleared to the sharp and particular brilliance of a Montana night after heavy snow, Ezra went up the hill. He went in his coat and his boots, and the snow came to his knees in the deeper drifts, and the cold was absolute and honest. And the 2 white crosses stood in the moonlight under the bare branches of the cottonwood with the patient permanence of things that have been placed with care and intend to remain. He stood before them for a time without speaking. Then he said quietly to the cold air and the moonlight and whatever remained of the people he had loved first and lost, "Eleanor, I want you to know that I have not forgotten. I will not forget. You are in this house. You are in the curtains you chose and the kitchen you organized, and in the way I learned to be careful from watching you be careful. Henry is in the way I know how to listen, the particular small patience of it." He paused. "Tonight, there is another Henry, and a woman who understands what it means to lose people and has chosen to love anyway, not because the losing became easier, but because she decided that the loving was worth the cost of it. I think you would have recognized her. I think she would have recognized you." The wind moved through the bare cottonwood branches, that sound he knew better than any other sound in his life. "I am not replacing you," he said. "I am not filling the space you left. The space you left is yours, and it will always be yours. I am building in the space next to it." He put his hand briefly on the smaller cross. "Your boy's name lives in a new boy now. It will be said in this house every day. I will make sure he knows where it comes from." He stood for a while longer. The stars were very close in the cold, clear air, the way they get in places where there are no competing lights, the particular generosity of a sky that withholds nothing. Then he turned and walked back down the hill toward the house, where the lamplight in the kitchen window threw a warm rectangle across the snow, where a woman and a child were sleeping, where Gideon Briggs and Callum Pryor would arrive in the morning with their various opinions about the name Henry William and their considerable feelings about the whole situation, where the accounts for the Cattlemen's Association were stacked neatly on the kitchen table, where the ordinary and irreplaceable business of a life was waiting to be resumed. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table in the early quiet of a night becoming morning, and the house held him in its warmth, the warmth of a fire well tended and walls built to last, and a life that had been, against considerable odds and through considerable difficulty, reconstituted into something worth living forward into. Spring came in April, tentatively at first, and then with conviction, the snow retreating up the hillsides, the creek running full and cold, the grass coming green in the wake of the retreating white. The calves came, and the work came with them. The long days and short nights of a ranch in its working season. Nora learned it all. She made mistakes in the first week and cataloged them and did not make them again. By June, she could read the south pasture count at a glance and tell Gideon within 2 head what the tally would be before he finished riding the fence line. Henry William grew with the season, becoming by summer a person of distinct opinions, primarily regarding the timing of meals and the question of whether a wooden crib or a human arm was the superior sleeping surface. He had Ezra's dark hair and Nora's green eyes. Both parents observed this combination with the slightly stunned quality of people who cannot entirely believe that this specific thing exists and belongs to them. The Cattlemen's Association held its second meeting in April and its third in June. By summer, it had 19 member ranches and a collective agreement with the Army post 20 miles north that stabilized the income of every member against the price fluctuations that had always been the particular vulnerability of small, independent operations. Reed Garner drafted the formal charter. He was in correspondence with a law school in the territorial capital and had discovered, in the months since his public statement at Murphy's Saloon, that the law was a field he wished to pursue. Silas Garner did not attend the meetings. He managed his cattle and said very little to anyone, and the community's relationship with him had settled into something that was not warmth and not hostility, but a watchful and uneasy distance. Reed visited monthly. He came away from these visits with little to report except that his father was quieter than he had been, and that the large house built for a family now held one man and echoed accordingly. "This is its own kind of justice," Nora said when Ezra told her. Not satisfying exactly, but honest. On an afternoon in the August of that year, the summer full and golden and the mountains standing clear against an impossible blue, Ezra stood on the front porch of his house with Henry William on his hip and watched Nora in the garden she had planted in the spring. It had replaced the dead rose bed along the south wall and was now producing tomatoes and beans and 3 varieties of herbs, and in the corner she had designated as impractical but necessary a row of sunflowers that were currently the tallest things between the porch and the fence. She was talking to Henry William from across the garden, a running account of what she was doing and why, the kind of conversation that parents have with very young children, not because the child understands, but because the habit of explanation started early becomes a form of relationship before the understanding arrives to formalize it. Henry William, for his part, was watching the sunflowers with the concentrated attention of a person who has recently discovered that the world contains things that are very large and very yellow, and has not yet finished deciding what to make of them. Gideon came around the corner of the barn and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. 3 years ago, Gideon said, looking out at the garden and then at Ezra and then back at the garden, you looked like a man who had decided to finish out the days. Not in any dramatic way, just quietly, like a fire that has stopped taking new wood. He turned his hat once in his hands and put it back on. You look like a man who has taken new wood. Ezra looked out across the yard, at the woman in the garden and the child on his hip reaching toward the sunflowers with the absolute certainty of someone who has identified something they want and sees no reason why the wanting should not be immediately addressed. She came here with 17 cents, Ezra said, and a hat that did not sit straight, and 1 tear she wiped away before anyone was supposed to see it. I know. I was at the stable when you came back from the station. I went there to send her home. I know that too. Ezra was quiet for a moment. I was wrong about what I needed, he said. Not the way a man says it when he is pleased with himself for admitting something. The way a man says it when he has traveled a long and indirect route to a true thing and is simply reporting what he found at the end of it. I thought what I needed was to be left alone with what I had lost. It turned out what I needed was to be found by someone who understood losing and had decided to keep living anyway. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then he said he would tell Callum about the Thursday meeting and went back to the barn. Ezra stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard and opened the garden gate and went in. Nora looked up at him with the green eyes that had been looking at him since the platform at Silver Creek almost a year ago, with the expression he had learned to read and hoped never to stop reading. The slight smile that was her particular version of happiness, a happiness that had come through enough to know what it had cost and valued itself accordingly. He is trying to reach the sunflowers, she said. He has good taste, Ezra said. He took his son's small reaching hand in his own. He stood in the garden his wife had planted in the ground. His hands had worked for 14 years. The afternoon held them there in the full particular light of an August in Montana that neither of them had planned for, and both of them had earned. Above them on the hill, the 2 white crosses stood in the late sun beneath the cottonwood, patient and permanent and present, the way true things are present, not as endings but as part of the story, woven into the fabric of everything that came after, inseparable from the happiness and not diminished by it and not diminishing it, as all true losses are, as permanent and as survivable as the land itself.